Mercy, no. Okay. So today we are starting fresh. On a brand new unit. I hit record, right? Okay. Never again. And we're going to start talking about some broader ecological ideas, specifically focused on population abundances and dispersal. So how do organisms decide how they move about and exist from one location to the next? Okay, so we have a few major topics that we want to hit, and some of these we're going to come back and hit on in more detail as we revisit them later on. But so in general, we want to look at some themes of what drives overall population abundance. And a lot of this is going to come back to these ideas of niche and tolerances. Okay, so basically what allows you to either exist and thrive or exist and survive in a given area. We're also going to talk about disturbance. Okay, so meaning that there's a benefit to upheaval in small amounts in a given area. Okay, right? Because if we have absolute, perfect, in-the-box conditions, then if you are king of the mountain, right, then you're the top dog and no one else can really overthrow you. But if there's a little bit of disturbance to knock you off your hill, then other individuals can get a chance at the basket. And then we'll talk a little bit about range, right? Because just because you can live in one area doesn't mean that's the only area or even the best area for you. So how do organisms decide what is the furthest reach of their area? Okay, so let's look at some terms, okay, which to some degree are certainly, sounds so loud on the mic, are intuitive. Okay, so distribution versus abundance. Okay, so distribution is referring to the whole geographic area. Okay, so we're going to compare this to range in a bit, but in this case, I'm looking at where species can occur. Okay, and in some cases, we'll look at where they can versus where they specifically are. And we'll play these out at the end of our unit. Okay, when we're talking about abundance, okay, most of the time this is going to be a fraction. Okay, so it'll be number of squirrels per unit area, so like per hectare, right? So what we spend the most time on is trying to figure out what influences these two concepts. Okay, where do they go and how many are there? And this is what most policy is based on. Okay, if I don't want all of the caribou to die off, I understand that we have lower wintering herds of caribou over the last 10 years. Okay, so that's my abundance. Okay, then I want to understand why are there less of them. Okay, I want to follow the distribution of them. Okay, where are they living? Where all are their herds? Are they migrating the same locations that they migrate to? Okay, and how can I manage those populations? Okay, most of the time we use the word conservation. When we use the term harvest instead, usually we're talking about fisheries. We have a very biased perception of those kinds of food sources. Okay, so fish, lobster, clams, that whole business. Animals that you raise to then eat. And weirdly enough, despite the fact we tend to do the same for livestock, we don't use the word harvest for that. Okay, so pretty solid footing. Okay, generally intuitive terms, but we just want to make sure that we understand the specific definitions that we're using on as we pop forward. Okay, so remember when we use the term population, and we talked about this already in our first unit, that a population is specifically the same species. Okay, so all gray squirrels, not even all squirrels, right? All gray squirrels. Okay. Now, there are a lot of ways that you can define population and species. Okay, we could have a whole class on that. But we're going to just dampen it and say if you're going to be the same species, you, one, have to be able to reproduce together. Okay, so sexual reproduction has to be involved with some kind of viable offspring. Okay, so that's one of the interactions that have to occur when I say interact. And there has to be competition. Okay, what we call intra-specific. So I know most of the time when we think of, really? That's the default. Let's try this again. Most of the time, specific. When we think about competition, when we think about inter-specific. Bless you. Inter-specific would be something like squirrel versus chipmunk. Okay, two different, this is why you don't do it on the fly. Two different species that compete with one another. Deer versus moose. Okay, whatever the case is. So two different species that are still going to compete for some kind of similar resource. Okay, squirrel versus bird, right? Fighting over something in tree. Okay, so that's interspecific, inter being, right, between species. We'll talk a lot about this type of competition. Okay, but intraspecific means within. Okay, so within your own species, you're still going to have some kind of competition. Absolutely disgusting. Okay, I'm still going to compete, okay, as a male with other males in my species for the ladies. Okay, we're all competing for the same female pool. So I can only breed with ladies of my species. Okay, so we're all going to dance the same dance. We're all going to try to be the brightest kind of red, sing the loudest calls to get the same girls. Okay, that's intra-specific competition. Okay, I'm a gray squirrel. I'm going to fight another gray squirrel. Okay, chattering, clawing, right? You see them spinning around the branches over space, okay, or food stashes. That's intra-specific competition. Okay, and sometimes, particularly if you have a particularly healthy, right, or large population abundance, this is a more vicious version, right, because there's a lot of you. Okay. So if you're going to be called a population, a species, both of these things have to occur. And that's a nice, simple, easy, tangible definition. Make sense? Okay, there's a lot of definitions out there. Your book can get kind of crazy with it. Bird people get real weird with it. Okay, we're just going to stick with this. Okay, so let's talk about abundance a little bit more. Okay, so I mentioned this is number over area. This is the way that we really want to specifically report this. Okay, so that number, right, is number of individuals. Okay, or we can think of it as density. Okay, most of the time, this is the most useful. Okay, so for example, we may know the population size of Earth is like 7 billion or whatever it is now. Okay, that's not helpful. Okay, we know it's a lot, but you know that some areas, right, like America, China, and India, have a lot of people, okay, whereas areas like Siberia have very few, right, or areas like Antarctica that have none. Well, none permanent-ish. Very few. We'll stick with very few. Okay, so looking at population density gives us a much better area or idea. Okay, now that being said, okay, in order to give a density, you actually have to know. Okay, so even when I was talking about humans, I just kind of did a stumble because understanding whether or not someone lives permanently at the air pad at Antarctica, I wasn't possible or sure. And I actually know people that have gone to Antarctica. And I still kind of stumbled on that one. Okay, so it is difficult to know where organisms are sometimes. Okay, in some areas we know better than others, even for something like humans. And so certainly we can imagine, even though we know this is the better number to report, it's the harder number to report. Okay? We do not know how the forest of Borneo breaks down. Okay? And some organisms, if we think about like the okavango in Africa, okay, becomes very fluid. Okay? Organisms have to move a lot in the dry season, okay, but congregate really well in the gorgeous, fabulous wet season. Okay, if you're not familiar with that area, by the way, look it up. It is like the best place on earth. It's so fabulous. Okay. So oftentimes population size gets reported more. Now population size is still valuable, okay, particularly since, as we'll talk about, there is a minimum population size that matters. Right? If you get below a certain number, there's not enough of you to like breed and not be super inbred and all of this stuff. So population size is still helpful, it's just not as good most of the time. It's just easier. With me so far, this seems good. Okay, so we can kind of figure out where do we get these numbers, how easy are these numbers to get, report, and all that business. Okay, so let's look at some of these. I like real data. The graph could look better. All right. So the other reason this can be interesting to look at is, as we know, abundance is not stagnant. Okay? We know that it can grow or change. Okay? And for some species, it grows and changes more than others. So if I'm looking at insects, and insects are particularly good to look at because some species change super fast, okay, and some species are very stable. So I'm looking at species that feed on goldenrod. This middle picture here is a species of goldenrod, so you can get an idea of what that looks like if you're not familiar. Okay, so even though the sites that we looked at had more or less similar climatic conditions. So we held our climate pretty controlled. So we're pretty sure that that didn't change. Our overall insect abundances still varied pretty widely. And all of these are done by depth. So as we're looking, you see we have about 10 years here. Particularly, so this first one's pretty stable in that there's not very many. But particularly if we look at these second two, okay, we see that there's quite a bit of variation. If you guys can't see, this is species count per 100 centimeters. So that's the reason the numbers are quite small. So these are pretty high densities for the most part, except for probably this one. So if we look at these bottom two, we see pretty wide fluctuations. And if we just focus on this middle one, we find that for these first 5-ish years, it's really not much for abundance at all. Okay, then we have kind of what a mini glut, and then it starts to taper off again. Okay, this middle one, and we always have quite a few, but how many that is seems to kind of be all over the place. We almost have kind of an oscillating pattern, right? Okay. Whatever it is, it's certainly not based on climate data. And it's not based on their food source. Okay. So generally, particularly with some populations, we know that they can just fluctuate really widely. And it's something that when we're reporting data, we just need to be aware of. They're hard to track, they're hard to count, and they do have wide fluctuations. So when you're tracking something like this little cutie, right, you would know, well, I would expect, let's get that box out of there, a fluctuation between, 3 to 25, potentially. Anything out of that range might flag me. If they're completely gone, I know something's wrong. If all of a sudden I have 30 or 40, I know something weird's happening. I would even almost say something like this for sustained years would be weird, right? But having a sudden drop, that's not necessarily weird, right? For this species. Now, if I was counting leopards, that'd be freaking weird. Counting 5 leopards would be freaking weird. So different species have different patterns, and you just have to know your patterns. Okay. Everybody see that? How we're using that? Okay. So population abundance is valuable, but you have to understand different data will provide you different information. And different organisms will provide you different data. Okay. Any questions so far? Let's look at tolerances then. So with tolerances, we're going to lay on top of abundance. Okay, what are the survivable conditions for an organism to have those abundances in their given distribution area? So there are several features that go into this. Okay, the first of which, of course, is habitat suitability, and there's going to be several pieces that go into that. Okay, and a lot of that comes down to these abiotic features. Okay, remember, abiotic means never living. Okay, and what exactly these are sometimes depends on the organism themselves. And how much they can tolerate definitely depends on the organism themselves. So we're gonna, or you this week are looking at this right now as you're writing up your biotic index, right? So some of those organisms have really high tolerances. So having a high tolerance means that I can deal with something that has a nasty pH or high pollution levels. I'm very tolerant. I don't care, right? Leeches are kind of like this. Okay, you could drop me in a vat of acid, and I could hack it for a while. And I'm a beast. A lot of beetles, okay, fly larvae. Okay, these guys are tough. Okay, they come from bad neighborhoods. I don't care. Boom. Okay. Other species, okay, mayflies, okay, some dragonflies, okay, have more delicate natures. Okay, they have narrower ranges that they can tolerate. So if you find a lot of those, then you know the area isn't polluted because they only can handle a pH of this to this, a temperature of this to this. Okay, a little bit of nitrate and their legs get all twitchy. Right? They won't breed there anymore because everybody's gonna die. Okay, bothers their noses and blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. Okay, so this is what I mean when we're talking about tolerance. Okay. So you won't find everybody in one place because then it's too much competition, right? So I'm just going to go where I can tolerate it because then I don't have to put up with Little Miss Delicate. Right? I'm just going to go where it's tough because I can hack it and there's less people there. Right? All animals are like this. We just happen to have collected insects this week. So you've directly handled those. But all animals are like this. Gray squirrels versus red squirrels. I can handle more bitter nuts. Okay. Ashier skies. Well, nobody can handle what's going on in California right now, but generally. Okay. So this is why with some species, if we focus specifically on pH, or not pH, my bad, temperature. pH too, but if we focus specifically on temperature, you have some organisms that you find really close to the equator, where it's very, very warm. Okay, like tropical birds. Okay, they like it nice and warm. And other birds that you only find up here, right? Because they're tough and they don't care that it's, 40 degrees some mornings. Okay. And they think the toucan's just a little prissy. But because they're spread out around these ranges too, not everybody's sitting at the equator, so there's less competition for any given item. Okay, so an example. Went out of my way to pick a plant this time. Watson would be proud. So, bush is tolerant of dry, cold conditions. So we see this spread really wide. Okay, so it has a wide tolerance range. This is our orange. The saguaro cactus, which is a very cool looking plant if you're not familiar, can tolerate really, really dry stuff. Okay, but not so much with the cold. These are darker. Okay. So the key is, you can see with the dotted line, okay, pretty much anything outside that bounds gets something that freezes, right? Some kind of frost. Okay. So it doesn't mind that it's dry, okay, but it doesn't do well with the cold. And so the cactus is going to be really competitive in that brownish splotch. And you're going to find a lot more of it there. Okay. But all of these other areas, okay, the bush can tan out because, surprisingly, right, the desert does get cold for small periods of time. Okay. It can hack these really short periods of time where we get really chilly desert nights. Not during the day. Okay. So in this case, these tolerances are dictating distribution. Okay. Let's look at another one. Okay, so in this case, this is a combination of both abiotic and biotic features. Okay, so a species of two species of barnacle, the balanus, both are restricted by temperature. Okay, so if we look at the map we have here, this whole range that we have outlined in the red and the blue would be an ideal location. Okay, based on the type of temperature that it needs to live in to thrive. Okay, the problem that the balanus barnacle has is that it is obscenely non-competitive. So if you're not super familiar with barnacles, basically they just stick themselves permanently as a larva to some kind of rock surface, face down, calcify, and then filter feed their entire life. So their life's pretty tricky because you have to pick this perfect location. And if you pick wrong, you're pretty much doomed. You're going to freeze to death. You're going to starve to death. Right? Turns out being a couch potato is a pretty rough life. Okay. What ends up happening is other shelled organisms, things like limpets and snails, sometimes clams, although they have to come up pretty far, will come up and dig themselves. I hope everybody can see that. Okay. Dig themselves up underneath and pop them off the rocks because they want their spot. Okay, they're in this really great intertidal zone when they're in a good spot where it's like perfectly warm. There's lots of clean, foodie water that continuously washes over them. So in this blue area, okay, these are prime area. The temperature is X perfect, okay, gets the most tides, so there is obscene competition here. Most limpets, the most snails. Barnacles, not super competitive. And like I said, you stick down once, and they have zero defenses besides whatever adhesive they stuck on their butts. So in this area, it's so competitive that they just get scraped off every time they stick themselves down there. And it is impossible for them to live in this space. Not that they don't want to, not that they're not tolerant there, okay, but they're not tolerant of the competition. Okay, so in this case, the last example we saw was abiotic features. Okay, things like the cold that kept organisms from distributing and establishing abundance in an area. But this example, it's a biotic feature. Okay, the inability to compete successfully to establish themselves. in a prime area. And this is Alaska, right? You can see Russia from here. Okay, any questions about that? Did that all feel pretty good? Okay, so let's just start to talk about disturbance a little bit, which is going to really play a role as this combination of abiotic and biotic factors that help dictate whether or not an organism is going to be able to establish itself successfully and be competitive in an area. So it's really going to be a nice tie-in of all the things we've talked about so far. Okay, so many times species distributions and species abundance is at least in part decided on to some degree by disturbance. Okay, now disturbance often, but is not exclusively, some kind of abiotic event. And we'll talk about a few that are biotic, but more often it's abiotic. Flooding, fire, okay, fire is certainly a big one lately. Tornadoes, okay, something that sort of washes through and clean sweeps an area, okay. So if we think about like California, okay, and kind of the example I have up here right now, okay, bless you. A fire would come through a forest and it's going to burn down an area, okay. Now different organisms are going to be different, not really huge ones, okay, but a general forest fire, right, a wildfire. Most organisms are either going to be depleted out or at least damaged by the fire. Okay. So what this does then is open the canopy up, right? So everybody that was shaded or couldn't get sunlight before now have this sudden hot second of opportunity where there was absolutely none before. Okay. Forest floor that for maybe 100 or more years that was only getting less than 10% of sunlight now has 90% plus sunlight. Okay, so, okay, fast growing plants, usually grasses and shrubberies, okay, are going to get a chance to grow, and we see what's called succession. And that's what you see here, where all of these plants will slowly get a chance to take over, and everything regrows. Okay, things like wildfires, not to the scale that we see right now, but wildfires and such are normal and natural. Okay, and the forest regrows. Okay, but it gives a chance for organisms that were maybe compressed or outcompeted to come in. New species of trees, for example, new species of shrubberies. Okay, and so, as we see here, normally periodic fires are natural, right? Every 50 or 100 years. Humans alter this pattern because we don't want any fires to happen. So we get like freaking enormous fires every 200 years that destroy entire states. But normally we get periodic fires. Okay? And so oftentimes you only get certain species, right? Some softwood trees, ponderosa pines, for example, okay, that only get a chance to come in if you see these forests do small burns, usually in small segments, okay, every 50 years or so. Okay, we'll pick up talking about disturbance, I guess, on Monday. So we'll review disturbance.